Good morning. Today we want to talk about fairy tales, and the people most associated with fairy tales are the Brothes Grimm. Can you give a little bit of historical background as to who were the Brothes Grimm?
Yes, the Brothes Grimm were two German, highly educated gentlemen, two brothers, that took on the task of looking at the development of German culture through the historic evidence of fairy tales.
And why are they important today?
They are important today because it is an extensive research based on cultural activities of a very cohesive country, something that we don't seem to value anymore at the present time. They were highly educated in Marburg, Germany, and they had lived through very good times and great poverty. Their father was a highly educated jurist, and they attended the university, where they became very interested in what leads to what. And during the early days in Germany, while there was no electricity and households were busy during the day and people were sitting around a fire in the evening and learning history as well as behavior through fairy tales that were written and passed on by word of mouth from generation to generation. And the brothers took on the task of actually talking to the people to find out where those stories came from, how long they have been in existence, and how they had changed over the years.
What's the dividing line between fairy tales and religion?
Fairy tales usually encompass a number of things, such as morality, as history, and prognosis of behavior. So one could say that the influence is multifaceted and extremely helpful to the education of young people. The brothers actually were so admired that in Prussia their fairy tales were included in the scholastic requirements of education for young people.
What did they want young people to learn from the fairy tales?
They wanted young people to learn consequences for actions.
And how do you think fairy tales relate to the term folk wisdom?
Folk wisdom is something that is acquired through a lifetime by a number of people. When you're talking to young people, they neither have the experience nor the insight. But if you can present them causes and effects on the basis of fairy tales, it usually can be very well understood by young people.
Now, you chose a relatively obscure fairy tale to analyze, The Fisherman and His Wife. Can you give a factual rundown as to what happened in that story?
Yes, I chose out of the complete book of Grimm's fairy tales, I chose a rather unknown story. Most people are familiar with Snow White, with Little Red Cap, and some of the fairy tales that were actually put into movies by Disney in later years. The one that I chose is not very well known, but there is certainly a story of morality. And it is a story of a fisherman who goes to the sea, and as he sits and fishes, a large fish approaches him, and he catches the fish. And the fish says to the man, "I am a prince, please let me go, and I can do things, and I can do things for you." The man hesitates for a moment, but he lets the fish go. He goes home and he tells his wife. And the wife said, "Ah, you missed out. We live in this hovel here, and you should have asked if the fish, if I let you go, you need to do something for me. You need to give us a better house." And so he goes back and he sits at the shore, and the water is welling up. And he is thinking, is this going to work? And he said, "Fish, fish, please come to me. I need to talk to you." And the fish comes again, and the fish says, "What can I do for you?" And he said, "My wife and I don't necessarily agree on everything, but she wishes we had a better house." And the fish says to him, "Okay, go home and you'll have a better house." He goes home and there is a better house. The wife said, "This is fine, but I'd like a bigger house." And the gentleman, the fisherman, is rather distraught, and he doesn't know what to do, but he goes back and he sits at the shore and he said, "Fish, fish, can you help me again?" And the fish said, "What is it that you want this time?" And he said, "My wife would like a castle." And the fish says, "Okay, go back and you'll be living in a castle." The man goes back and he walks into the door and he's living in a castle. To make a long story short, this goes on for 3 more times. There are different versions of the story, and some of them the wife goes on, she wants to be a queen, and then she wants to be a pope. That has been altered a number of times. Usually the stories end when she becomes a queen, and the fisherman comes home and she's a queen, and he goes back to the fish and the fish says, "What do you want now?" And the man said, "My wife is still not happy." And so the fish said, "Oh, okay, well then go home and she'll be happy." He goes home and he's back living in his hovel, and the wife is happy. I thought this was a very interesting version of teaching somebody, if you're never happy, there is nothing that can be done for you, and you might as well go back to square one. To me, the emphasis is psychology. It is self-reliance. It is also the fisherman being pushed by somebody that he doesn't necessarily agree with. And it is also religious, when you think about people praying for things, God give me this, and God gives them that, and they want something else. And so this story not only talked about poverty, it talked about religion, it talked about happiness, it talked about getting along with somebody, it talked about one person being pushed by somebody else, it talked about the wife not doing for herself but trying to work through her husband, and any other number of issues. Many fairy tales are done in this context of an education. You think about it, and therefore fairy tales were popular among adults, because I think even adults can learn from a story such as this.
Do you think that this fairy tale is easily adapted to the modern world about materialism versus spiritual contentment?
I think it is very adaptable, because you often see that people that are very well off are not at all happy. You know, they particularly when you look at Americans, you know, you can remodel your kitchen 6 times and you're still not happy, or you can add to your house, or you can buy a new house, and by the time you have plenty of money to buy the biggest house, you move in, and very shortly thereafter you get a divorce, because happiness is not brought on by something outside of yourself.
Do you think there's a danger that people could just be led to be content with what they have and not strive for anything more?
I think if people are led to be content, this can be a problem too. For instance, if you choose not to work, but you don't have any money, it can be a problem. But contentment comes from what you think you need, and is often a difficult situation, particularly with people that have opportunities and money to buy and get more and more. Contentment usually does not work.
So the fairy tale is kind of telling people that the man should have stopped after being granted the first wish.
Maybe, and maybe he should not have been pushed at all to ever to go back. Maybe he could have said to the wife, we're doing the best we can with what we have. Let's be happy. You can kind of stop at every stage, because the way the story ends, again, in different versions, he's not being punished for going back, and she's not being punished for demanding either, except the outcome is not satisfactory when you get more and more.
Well, at the final wish, it seems as if there is a punishment in that the family returns to their condition, but before they started asking for wishes. But I think the viewer is led to think of, what if the family had stopped earlier? What if the family had just taken something but not tried to strive for everything?
I think that is a very good point. He could have stopped at any time, but I think the story tries to tell you that if you just want more and more, you will find that when you go back to square one, it's just as good, because the happiness has to come from you, from within.
Does the fairy tale also suggest that people should strive and struggle for what they want, and that if they're simply given something, this is not good for the human condition?
I think that is built in, because the fisherman is sitting and fishing, and the wife is at home complaining. In the fairy tales, there is no mention of anybody doing much of anything. It doesn't talk about her cooking food, and it doesn't talk about him farming or doing any work either. It's kind of built into the story, and a lot of the Grimm's Märchen stories are like that. Is you kind of have to think yourself through. And criticism by a number of psychologists, including Bruno Bettelheim, are like, yes, these Grimm's fairy tales are extremely helpful to children.
Thank you very much.